Good morning. We are back for some more of Book 2 in the Nancy Drew series, The Hidden Staircase. Now, if you will remember last time, we found Nancy drifting off to sleep after the little masquerade party and dance that they had with Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary. And as Nancy was drifting off to sleep, she realized that the wall behind the trunk in the attic was a little different. And so the next morning, she was determined she was going to find that secret entrance that she feels so sure is in the mansion. As soon as the girls woke the next morning, Nancy told Helen her plan. "I'm with you," said Helen. "Oh, I wish we could solve this mystery. I'm afraid it's beginning to affect Miss Flora's health, and she won't leave Twin Elms. Maybe we can get Aunt Rosemary to keep her in the garden most of the day. It's beautiful outside, and we might even serve lunch under the trees." "I think they'd like that," said Helen. "As soon as we get downstairs, let's suggest it." Both women liked the suggestion. Aunt Rosemary had guessed their strategy and was appreciative of it. "I'll wash and dry the dishes," Nancy offered when breakfast was over. "Miss Flora, why don't you and Aunt Rosemary go outside and take advantage of the lovely sunshine?" The frail elderly woman smiled. There were deep circles under her eyes, indicating that she'd had a sleepless night. "I will run the vacuum cleaner around the dust and dust the floor in less than half an hour," Helen said merrily, and her relatives caught the spirit of her enthusiasm. "I wish you girls lived here all the time," Miss Flora said. "Despite our troubles, you have brought joy back into this household and into our lives." Both girls smiled at the compliment, and as soon as the two women had gone outdoors, they set about to do their work with a strong will, and at the end of the half hour the first floor of the mansion was spotless. Nancy and Helen next went to the second floor, quickly made the beds, and tidied the bathrooms. "And now for that ghost," said Helen, brandishing her flashlight. Nancy took a look for her own in the bureau drawer. "Now let's see if we can figure out how to climb the attic stairs without making them creak. Knowing how may come in handy." This presented a real challenge. Every inch of every step was tried before the girls finally found a pattern to follow that allowed them to get up there noiselessly. Helen laughed. "This is certainly going to be a memory test, Nancy. First step, put your foot to the left near the wall. Second step, right center. Third step, against the right wall." "I think I'm going to need 3 feet to get this done." Nancy laughed. "I think I'll skip the second step. Let's see. On the 4th and 5th, it's all right to step in the center, but the 6th you hug the left wall, the 7th the right wall. But if you step on the 8th in any place, it creaks. So we better skip that. 9, 10, and 11 are okay," Nancy recalled, "but from there to 15 at the top, we're in trouble." "How about skipping 14 and then stretching as far as we can to reach the top one at the left, where it doesn't squeak?" Nancy replied. She and Helen went back to the second floor and began what was meant to be a silent ascent, but both of them made so many mistakes that they ended up laughing, causing more noise than ever. Finally, however, the girls had the silent spots memorized and went up noiselessly. Nancy clicked on her flashlight and swung it into the nearest wood-paneled wall. Helen stared at it. "This isn't made of long panels from ceiling to floor. It's small pieces." "That's right," said Nancy. "But see if you don't agree with me that the spot back of the costume trunk near the chimney looks different. The grain doesn't match the other wood." The girls crossed the attic and Nancy beamed her flashlight over the paneling. "It does look different," Helen agreed. "This could be a door, but there's no knob or hardware." She ran her fingers over a section just above the floor, following the cracks at the edge of a 4x2 and a half-foot space. "If it's the secret door," said Nancy, "the knob is on the other side." "So how are we going to open it?" Helen questioned. "We might try prying the door open, but first I want to test it." She tapped the entire panel with her knuckles. A look of disappointment came over her face. "There's no hollow spot." "Let's make sure," said Helen. "Suppose I go downstairs and get a screwdriver and a hammer, and we'll see what happens when we drive the screwdriver through this crack." "Good idea, Helen." While she was gone, Nancy inspected the rest of the attic, walls and floor. She did not find another spot which seemed suspicious, but by this time Helen had returned. Inserting the screwdriver into one of the cracks, she began to pound on the handle of it with the hammer. Nancy watched hopefully. The screwdriver went through the crack very easily, but immediately met obstruction on the other side. "Nancy, you try your luck," Helen said, pulling out the screwdriver. So Nancy picked a different spot, but the results were the same. "My hunch wasn't so good," sighed Nancy. Helen suggested that they give up and go downstairs. "Anyway, I think the postman will be here soon, and I'm expecting a letter from Jim. Mother said she would forward all my mail." Nancy did not want to give up the search, but nodded in agreement and followed her friend downstairs. The young detective sat on the floor and sent her friend downstairs, but the young detective sat on the floor and cupped her chin in her hands. As she stared ahead, Nancy noticed that Helen, in her eagerness to meet the postman, had not bothered to go quietly down the attic steps. It sounded as if Helen had picked the squeakiest spot on each one. Nancy heard Helen go to the front door and suddenly realized that she was in the big mansion all alone. "That may bring the ghost on a visit," she thought. "If he is around, he may think I went out with Helen, and I may learn where the secret opening is." So she sat perfectly still, listening intently. Suddenly, she flung her head up. Was it imagination, or did she hear the creak of steps? No, she was not mistaken. Nancy strained her ears, trying to determine where they were coming from. "I'm sure they're not from the attic stairs or the main staircase, and not the back stairway. Even if the ghost was in the kitchen and unlocked the door to the second floor, he'd know that the one at the top of the stairs was locked from the other side." Nancy's heart gave a leap. She was positive the creaking sounds were coming from somewhere behind the attic wall. "There is a secret staircase," she thought excitedly. "Maybe the ghost is entering the second floor." Nancy waited until the sound stopped. Then she got to her feet and tiptoed noiselessly down the attic stairs and looked around. She didn't hear anything. Was the ghost standing quietly in one of the bedrooms? Probably Miss Flora's. Moving ever so silently, so she would not make a sound, Nancy peered into each room, but no one was in there. "Maybe he's on the first floor," Nancy thought. She descended the main stairway, hugging the wall, so she wouldn't make a sound. Reaching the first floor, Nancy peered into the parlor. No one was there. The library, the dining room, the kitchen, no one was there. Well, the ghost didn't come into the house after all, Nancy concluded. Maybe he intended to, but changed his mind. She felt more certain than at any time, however, that there was a secret entrance to Twin Elms and a hidden staircase. But how to find it? Oh, that was the problem. But suddenly the young detective snapped her fingers. "I know what I'll do. I'm going to set a trap for that ghost." She reflected that he'd taken jewelry, but the thefts had stopped. Apparently, he was afraid to go to the second floor. I wonder if anything is missing from the first floor. Maybe he's taken silver or helped himself to food. Going back to the back door, Nancy opened it and called to Helen, who was now seated in the garden with Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary. "Let's say we start lunch," she called, not wishing to distress Miss Flora by bringing up the subject of the mystery or the ghost. "Okay," called Helen, and in a few minutes she joined Nancy, who asked her friend if she'd received a letter. "I sure did," her eyes sparkled. "Oh, Nancy, I can hardly wait for Jim to get home." Nancy smiled. "The way you describe him, I can hardly wait to meet him." Then she told Helen the real reason she had called her into the kitchen and described the footsteps on what she was sure was a hidden stairway. Then added, "If we discover that food or something else is missing, we'll know he's been here again." Helen offered to inspect the silver. "I know approximately how many pieces there should be." "And I'll look over the food supplies," Nancy said. "I have a pretty good idea what was in the refrigerator and in the pantry." It was not many minutes before each of the girls discovered missing items. Helen said that nearly a dozen teaspoons were gone, and Nancy figured that several cans of food, some eggs, and even a quart of milk had been taken. "It's like it's impossible to catch this thief," Helen said. On a sudden hunch, Nancy took down from the wall a memo pad and pencil which hung there. Putting her finger to her lips to indicate to Helen not to say anything, Nancy wrote on the sheet, "I think the only way to catch the ghost is to trap him. I believe he has one or more microphones hidden someplace and that he hears all our plans." Nancy looked up at Helen, who nodded silently, and Nancy wrote, "I don't want to worry Miss Flora or Aunt Rosemary, so let's keep the plan a secret. I suggest we go to bed tonight as usual and carry on a conversation about our plans for tomorrow, but actually we won't take off our clothes. Then about midnight, let's tiptoe down to watch. I'll wait in the kitchen. Do you want to stay in the living room?" Helen nodded. Nancy, thinking that they'd been quiet too long, and that if there was an eavesdropper nearby might become suspicious, said aloud, "What would Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary like for lunch, Helen?" Helen found it a little difficult to transfer to the new subject. They both love soup." "I'll make cream of chicken soup," said Nancy. "Hand me that can of chicken and rice, will you? And I'll get the milk." As Helen was doing this, Nancy lit the match and held her recently written note over the sink to set fire to the paper. "Nancy thinks of everything," Helen smiled to herself. The girls chatted happily as they prepared the food and finally carried 4 trays to the garden. They did not mention their midnight plan, and the day in the garden was proving to be just what Miss Flora needed, and the girls were sure she would sleep well that night. Nancy's plan was followed to the letter, and just as the grandfather clock in the hall was striking midnight, Nancy arrived in the kitchen and sat down to wait. Helen was posted in the living room chair near the hallway. Moonlight streamed in both rooms, but the girls had taken seats in the shadows. Helen was mentally rehearsing the further instructions Nancy had written during the afternoon, and the young sleuth had suggested that if Helen should see anyone, she would run to the front door, open it, and yell, "Police!" At the same time, she was to try to watch where the intruder disappeared. Time ticked by, not a sound in the house. Then suddenly, Nancy heard the front door open with a bang, and Helen yelled, "Police! Help! Police!" By the time Nancy reached the front hall, Tom Patrick, the guard, had rushed into the house. "Here I am," he called. "What's the matter?" Helen led the way to the living room and switched on the chandelier light. "The sofa next to the fireplace," Helen said. "It moved. I saw it. I saw it move." "You mean somebody moved it?" "I don't know. I didn't see anybody, but I saw it move." Nancy walked to the old-fashioned sofa, set in the niche along the fireplace. Certainly the piece was in place now. If the ghost had moved it, he'd returned it to the original position. "Let's pull it out and see what we can find," Nancy suggested. She tugged at one end while the guard pulled at the other. It occurred to Nancy that the person who'd moved it had to be very strong. "Do you think your ghost came up through a trapdoor or something?" Neither of the girls replied. They had previously searched the area, and even now as they looked over every inch of the floor and the 3 walls surrounding it, they could detect nothing that looked like an opening. By this time, Helen was looking sheepish. I guess I was wrong. I'm sorry to have taken you away from your work. Don't feel badly. But I had better get back to my guard duty," he said, and left the house. "Oh, Nancy," Helen said, "I'm so sorry." She was about to say more, but Nancy put a finger to her lips. They could use the same strategy for trapping the thief another time. In case the thief might be listening, Nancy did not want to give away their secret. Nancy felt that after the uproar the ghost would not appear again that night, so she motioned to Helen that they would go quietly up the stairs and get some sleep. Hugging the walls and the stairway once more, they ascended noiselessly, tiptoed to their room, and got into bed. "I'm certainly glad I didn't wake Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary," said Helen sleepily. Though Nancy had been sure the ghost would not enter the mansion again that night, she discovered in the morning that she'd been mistaken. More food had been stolen sometime between midnight and 8 o'clock when she and Helen started breakfast. Had the ghost taken it for personal use or only to worry them? I missed my chance this time, Nancy murmured to her friend. After this, I'd better not trust what the ghost's next move may be. At 9 o'clock, Hannah Gruen telephoned. Nancy happened to answer the ring, and after the usual greetings, was amazed to hear Hannah say, "I'd like to speak to your father." "Hannah, Dad isn't here. Don't you remember the telegram said he wasn't coming?" "He's not there? Oh, Nancy, this is bad," Hannah exclaimed. "Very bad." "What do you mean, Hannah?" Nancy asked fearfully. Hannah explained that soon after receiving the telegram on Tuesday, Mr. Drew himself had phoned. He wanted to know if you were still at Cliffwood. When I told him yes, he said he'd stop off there on his way home Wednesday. Nancy was frightened, but held her voice steady when she said, "Hannah, did you happen to mention the telegram to him?" "No, I didn't," she replied. "I didn't think it was necessary." "Hannah," Nancy said, almost in tears, "I'm afraid the telegram was a trick." "A trick!" Mrs. Gruen cried out. "Yes. Dad's enemies sent it to me to keep me from meeting him." "Oh, Nancy," Hannah wailed, "you don't suppose those enemies that Mr. Gomber warned us about have waylaid your father and are keeping him prisoner?" "I'm afraid so," said Nancy, her knees beginning to shake. She sank down into the chair by the telephone. "What are we going to do?" Hannah asked. "Do you want me to notify the police?" No, not yet. Let me do some checking first." "All right, Nancy," Hannah said, "but you let me know what happens, please." "Oh, Hannah, I will," she assured her. Nancy put down the phone, then looked at the various directories laying on the table. Finding one which contained River Heights numbers, she looked for the number of the telegraph office and put in a call. She asked the clerk who answered to verify that there had been a telegram from Mr. Drew on Tuesday. After a few minutes, the reply came, "We have no record of that." Nancy thanked the clerk and hung up. By this time, her hands were shaking. What had happened to her dad? Getting control of herself, Nancy telephoned in turn to the airport, the railroad station, and the bus lines in Cliffwood. She inquired about any accidents which may have occurred on the trips from Chicago the previous day or on Tuesday night. There had been none. Each time, the caller confirmed. "What am I going to do?" Nancy thought in dismay. Immediately an idea came to mind, and she put in a call to the Chicago hotel where her father was registered. Although she thought it unlikely, it was just possible he'd changed his mind and was still there. But a conversation with the desk clerk dashed that hope. "No, Mr. Drew is not here. He checked out Tuesday. I don't know his plans, but I'll connect you with the head porter. He may be able to help." In a few seconds, Nancy was asking the porter what he could tell her to help clear up the mystery of her father's disappearance. "All I know, miss, is that your father told me he was taking a sleeper train and would be getting off somewhere Wednesday morning to meet his daughter." Thank you very much," Nancy said. "You've been a great deal of help." So, her father had taken the train home and probably had reached the Cliffwood station. Next, she had to find out what had happened to him after that. Nancy told Aunt Rosemary and Helen what she had learned, then got into her convertible and drove directly to the Cliffwood train station. There, she spoke to the ticket agent. Unfortunately, he could not identify Mr. Drew from Nancy's description as having been among the passengers. Nancy went to speak next to the taximan. Judging by the line of cabs, she decided that all the drivers who served the station were on hand at the moment. There had been no outgoing trains for nearly an hour, and the incoming express was due in about 15 minutes. "This is lucky for me," the detective told herself. "Surely one of these men must have driven Dad." She questioned one after the other, but each one of them denied having Mr. Drew as a passenger. By this time, Nancy was panicking. She hurried inside the station, into a telephone booth, and called the local police. Nancy asked to speak to the captain, and in a moment he came on the line. "Captain Rosalind speaking," he said crisply. Nancy told her story and told of the warning her father had received in River Heights, and her fear that something was now not right and that her father was in danger and being held against his will. "Ooh, this is very serious, Miss Drew," Captain Rosalind stated. "I'm going to put men on this case at once." As Nancy left the phone booth, a large, gray-haired woman was walking up to me. "Pardon me, miss, but I couldn't help overhearing what you said. I believe I may be able to help you." Nancy was surprised and suspicious. Maybe this woman was connected with the abduction and planned to take Nancy prisoner too. "Don't look so frightened," the woman said. "All I wanted to tell you is that I'm down here at the station every day to take a train to the next town. I'm a nurse and I'm on a case over there right now." "I see," Nancy said. "Yesterday I was here when the Chicago train came in. I noticed a tall, handsome man, the one you described to be your father, get off the train. He got into a taxi driven by a man named Harry. I have a feeling that for some reason that cabbie isn't telling the truth. Let's talk to him." Nancy followed the woman, her heart beating furiously. She was ready to grab at any straw. "Well, hello, Miss Skade," the taximan said. "How are you today?" "I'm all right," the nurse responded. "Listen, Harry, you told this young lady you didn't carry a passenger yesterday that looked like her father, and I saw one get into your cab. What's going on?" Harry hung his head. "Listen, miss," he said to Nancy, "I got 3 kids and I don't want nothing to happen to 'em, okay?" "What do you mean?" Nancy asked, puzzled. When the man did not reply, Miss Skate said, "Look, Harry, this girl's afraid her father's been kidnapped, and it's up to you to help her by telling her everything you know." "Kidnapped?" the man shouted. "Oh, goodness! No, I don't know anything about that. No, now I don't know what to do." Nancy had a sudden thought. "Have you been threatened, Harry?" she asked. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. "Well, since you've guessed the problem, I guess I'd better tell you everything I know." Harry went on to say that he had taken a passenger fitting Mr. Drew's descriptions toward Twin Elms, which is where he said he wanted to go. But just as we were leaving, 2 other men came and jumped into the cab. They said they were going a little further than that, and would I take them? Well, about halfway to Twin Elms, one of the men ordered me to pull over to the side of the road and stop. He told me the stranger had blacked out and told me his buddy jumped out on the car and then he and his buddy jumped out of the car and laid that man on the grass. "How ill was he?" Nancy asked. "I don't know, but he was unconscious. Just then another car came along behind us and stopped. That driver got out and offered to take your father to the hospital, and the 2 men said okay." Maybe her father was in a hospital and had not been abducted at all. But a moment later, her hopes were again dashed when Harry said, "I told those 2 guys I'd be glad to drive the sick man to the hospital, but one of them turned on me and shook his fist and yelled, 'You just forget everything you just saw, or everything that's happened, or it's going to be too bad for you and those kids of yours.'" "Oh, no!" Nancy cried out. For a second, everything seemed to swim before her eyes, and she clutched the handle of the taxi for support. Now there was no question about it. Her father had been drugged and kidnapped. Miss Gade grabbed Nancy. "Do you feel ill?" the nurse asked quickly. "Oh, I'm going to be okay, but this news has been a shock to me." "Is there anything I can do to help?" the woman questioned. "I'll be happy to." Thank you, Nancy replied. "But I must get busy and do something about this. But you have been a huge help." The nurse suggested that perhaps Mr. Drew was in fact in a hospital and gave Nancy the number and names of all 3 in town. "I'll get in touch with them at once," Nancy answered, and again said, "You've been most kind. And here comes your train, Miss Skade. Goodbye, and thank you again so much for your help." Harry climbed out of his taxi and went to stand at the platform to signal passengers for his cab. Nancy hurried after him, and before the train came in, asked if he would please give her a description of the 2 men. Both were dark and kind of athletic looking, not really what you'd call handsome. One of them had an upper tooth missing, and the other fellow, well, his left ear was kind of crinkled, if you know what I mean. I think I understand, said Nancy. I'll give a description of these two men to the police. She went back to the phone booth and called each of the 3 hospitals, asking if anyone by the name of Carson Drew had been admitted, or possibly a patient who was not conscious at the time but had no identification. Only Mercy Hospital had a patient who was unconscious, but he was definitely not Mr. Drew. He was Chinese. Sure now that her father was being held hostage, Nancy went at once to the police headquarters and related the taximan's story. Captain Rosslyn was extremely concerned. I feel sure we can trace the fellow with the crinkly ear, and we'll make him tell us where your father is. I doubt, though, that there's anything you can do. You'd just better leave it to the police. Nancy said nothing. She was reluctant to give up even trying to do something, but she acquiesced. In the meantime, I'd advise you to remain at Twin Elms and concentrate on solving the mystery there. From what you tell me about your father, I'm sure he'll be able to get out of this difficulty himself, even before the police find him. Nancy promised to stay on call in case Captain Rosslyn might need her, but in her own mind the young sleuth was determined that if she got any kind of lead concerning her father, she would follow it up. Nancy left the police headquarters and strolled up the street deep in thought. Instead of things getting better, my problems seemed to be getting worse. But I'd better call Hannah. Since she'd been a little girl, Nancy had found great comfort in talking to Hannah. The housekeeper had always been able to give her good advice. So she went to the drugstore and entered one of the telephone booths and called the Drew home in River Heights, and was pleased when Mrs. Gruen answered. She was shocked and concerned to learn Nancy's news, but said she thought Captain Rosslyn's advice was good. You've given the police all the leads in the world, and I believe that's all you can do. But wait, Hannah said suddenly. If I were you, Nancy, I'd call up those railroad lawyers and tell them exactly what happened. Your father's disappearance is connected with that bridge project, and I'm sure the lawyers may have some ideas about where to find him. Oh, Hannah, that's a wonderful idea. I'm going to call them right away. But when the young detective phoned the lawyers, she was disappointed to learn that they were all out to lunch, and none of them would return before 2 o'clock. Oh dear, well, I guess I'd better get a snack while waiting for them to come back. But in her worried state, she did not feel like eating. There was a food counter near the drugstore, and Nancy made her way over to it. Perching on a high-backed stool, she read the menu over and over, but nothing sounded good. When the counterman asked her what she wanted, Nancy frankly said she did not know, that she wasn't hungry. Then I recommend our split pea soup. It's homemade and out of this world. All right, she shrugged. I'll try it. The soup was delicious, and by the time she'd finished it, Nancy's spirits had risen considerably. How about some custard pie? The counterman inquired. It's just like Mama used to make. He smiled. All right. The pie was ice cold and delicious, and when Nancy finished eating it, she glanced at her watch. It was only 1:30. Seeing a rack of magazines, she decided to wait the time away while reading in her car. So she purchased one that proved to have so many interesting stories that the half hour went by quickly. So promptly at 2, Nancy returned to the phone booth and called the office of the railroad lawyers. The switchboard operator connected her with Mr. Anthony Barradale, and Nancy judged from his voice that he was fairly young. Quickly she told the story. Mr. Drew being held prisoner, he cried out. Well, all those underhanded property owners, they certainly are going to great lengths to get a few more dollars. The police are working on the case, but I thought perhaps you would like to take a hand also, Nancy said. We certainly will, the young man replied. I'll speak to our senior partner. I know he's going to want to start working on this at once. Thank you, Nancy sighed. She gave the address and phone number of Twin Elms and asked that the lawyers get in touch with her if there are any news or breaks in the case. We'll do that, he promised. Nancy left the drugstore and walked back to her car. Climbing in, she wondered what her next move should be. One thing is for sure, she thought. Work is the best antidote for worrying, so I'll get back to Twin Elms and do some more sleuthing there. As she drove along, Nancy reflected about the ghost entering Twin Elms by an underground passage. Since she had found no sign of any of it in the outbuildings on the estate, it occurred to her that possibly it led from an obscure cave, either natural or man-made. Such a device would be a clever artifice for an architect to use. Taking a little used road that ran along one side of the estate, Nancy recalled having seen a long grassed over hill, which she had assumed to be an old aqueduct. Perhaps this was actually the hidden entrance to Twin Elms. She parked her car at the side of the road and took a flashlight from the glove compartment. In anticipation of finding the answer to her riddle, she crossed the field, and as she came closer to the beginning of the huge mound, she could see stones piled up. Getting nearer and nearer, she realized that it was indeed the entrance to a cave. Maybe this time I found it, she thought, hurrying forward. The wind was blowing strongly and tossed her hair around her face. Suddenly, a freakish gust of wind swept a newspaper from among the rocks and scattered the pages. Nancy was more excited than ever. The newspaper meant a human being had been here not long ago. The front page of the paper sailed toward her, and she grabbed it up. And to her complete astonishment, the paper was a copy of the River Heights Gazette, and the date was the Tuesday before. Someone interested in River Heights has been here, and recently, she thought excitedly. Who was it? Her father? Nathan Gomber? Wondering if the paper might contain any clue, Nancy dashed around to pick up all the sheets. As she spread them on the ground, she noticed a hole in the page of the classifieds ads. This may be a very good clue, Nancy thought. As soon as I get back to the house, I'm going to call Hannah and have her look it up in the paper at home. It suddenly occurred to Nancy that the person who had brought the paper to the cave might be inside. She better watch her step, because he was probably an enemy. This may even be where Dad is being held prisoner, she thought wildly. Flashlight in hand, her eyes darting intently about, Nancy proceeded cautiously into the cave. 5, 10 feet, no one. 15 feet, 20. Then Nancy met a dead end. The empty cave was almost completely round and had no other opening. Oh dear, another failure, Nancy told herself disappointedly as she retraced her steps. My only hope now is to learn something important from the ad in the paper. Nancy walked back across the field. Her eyes were down as she automatically looked for footprints. But presently she looked up and stared in disbelief. A man was standing alongside her car, examining it. His back was half turned toward Nancy, so she could not see his face. But he had an athletic build, and his left ear was crinkly. Okay, that is where we're going to end for today, but things are definitely getting exciting, and I think we can agree just maybe a little bit scary.